Is doing well today and having a start of a good weekend. We are going to have a lot um, to go through today, a little bit. So I'm going to get busy and start right away. The first thing I would like to share with you is Maureen sent me some pictures of the quilt that she is doing, some of the blocks, and they're quite happy and pretty. So I would like to share these with you. This is one block. I love the way she matched up the stripes there and got that to looking so good with that. Oh, I got the same one. Sorry. And let me get that one. And there is the other block, Bright and Happy Again. So and then I want to share this one with you. And so, doing a great job of choosing fabrics, and you can see, other possibilities that you could do with your blocks. Or color schemes or whatever. So thank you for sending those pictures in. It's great to see how everyone else is doing and progressing with that. So what a great quilt that's going to be when she's done. It's happy, and the fabrics are wonderful. So thank you for sending those and letting us all share in your beautiful quilt. All right, and then today we're going to be working on a signature block, and because we're going to be off the next 2 weeks for Christmas and New Year's, since it falls on the weekend, turkey tracks as well. So kind of jumping right into this, and be sure to put your questions, your comments, if you have anything to add that's been helpful to you or that you've been struggling with. With the signature block, there's a couple of things that I know that we talked about early on. We weren't dealing with the same issues that we are now, so I want to thoroughly go through some of those items again today that you'll see with your template in the book, and what I've kind of made a decision on. And I'm not going to necessarily show you the hand stitching on that, because we've gone through both curves last week and we've gone through those the week before. So there's really no difference in that, but I have basically redone my blocks. So I want to go through that thoroughly with you. And now that I have my machine back, and it was a thrill to get the phone call and say your machine's ready, and I could go pick it up, and I had that here. So we're going to do curves on the turkey track block today with a machine. So let's drop down to my book, and this is the signature block. And over here you can see where the center has, three different fabrics. It looks like 3 or 4 different fabrics in there, because the templates that go along with this one are like this, and there's 2 of them. I cut the top off, and I'll show you why in just a little bit, in terms of getting our blocks together. Actually, it goes this way. This was the hardest part for me, is learning how these templates went together. These are sewn in. If you come over here, you have your templates that come together like this, and you have that loop that goes through there. And at first I was going to applique them, and I made 2 that went into that, because each of these are sewn into the sides of the block. All right. And these are sewn onto this side, and then it's a 4 patch is what's happening here. So you sew those units together. You have 2 of them, and you sew them to the center template A. When I was doing that, I ran into a little bit of an issue because this comes down to a point, and here in the picture it shows that there's a point there. But if you look at the template, it's curved. There is no real point. I mean, you can imagine by folding it in half that it's going to hit in the top of that curve, and it goes in there, but it was a little bit tight, a little bit hard to fudge with. And so that's when I thought, well, let me go to applique, and I'll just use because it says over here it's a 12.5-inch block, and I double checked it in the back, unfinished, and a 12-inch block finished. So I did that and found the center point, and that's why I went to applique. And I thought, well, I'll just use a 12.5-inch back, and I'll applique these these pieces, make this one piece, and applique it to the back side. Well, it wasn't fitting in, and it wasn't making a 12.5-inch block. And what I discovered, let me find my template, is that I was off. It's somewhere between an 1/8 of an inch on the side. If I were to put that in there, and I don't know if you can see this on camera, but it was just a slight bit off. And see, it's not quite an 1/8 of an inch, and it's somewhere between an 1/8 and a 16th. So I started working with it. I'm not a math person, so I had to see it. So that's why there's all these lines, both inside and outside and whatever, to get this to fit into a 6.5-inch square. So that was the first thing I did, and then that changed that point in there, which made it a bit easier to work it in. But then I completely changed it because this was a lot of work, to be quite honest with you. You're still going to need to add that a little bit of an 1/8, to get your 16th and to make this, fit in there correctly. So what I did instead, let me share with you. I decided that I'm not going to go through and have this look like, that there's all those different fabrics and that there's a pinwheel in the center. So I decided I was okay with letting go of that. And so I made a 6.5-inch square, half square triangle is basically what I did. So I took 2 fabrics, made a half square triangle out of those 2 fabrics. We put that aside for a second. And then with my newly drawn, I basically am pinning this to the top of that and using it as an applique. So therefore, I made a second template, and I left my seam allowance there, and I trimmed away my seam allowance here, cut out so I could applique these 2 sides and fit them into my 6.5-inch block. It's going to look a little bit different, but not enough, because I still have my curves on both sides. It's still going to look like the block, more or less, but it's still going to have the pinwheel in the center. It's just not going to have 3 different or 4 different fabrics. It's going to have 2. And I was really okay with that. And I wanted to show you how I go about doing my applique. And I use the starch method. It, for me, has always proven to be pretty. So I've put a little bit of the Faultless Premium Starch. I don't get the flaking with this particular starch, and it's got the gold cap, and it seems to work the best of whatever I have. Let me make sure my iron is on. And I simply run, and I do not touch the paper. And I like the, you know, as I've told you before, the freezer paper and I are good friends. And so I have just run the starch along there, and it actually will migrate up to the, you know, the paper. And so I don't have to necessarily run it there. And let me move my book out of the way. You know, the small space sometimes becomes difficult. And then I simply, and I forgot to cut in the valleys, you know, to get them to move. And now that it's wet, it's going to be a little bit tougher. And I apologize. So I'm just cutting not quite up to that in the valleys of my applique, so it will turn nicely. So you can use a turning tool. The Applistick turning tools are absolutely wonderful. I just find that my fingers work really nice as well. And so I'm over here. Let me make sure that I'm in, turn that book, in the camera. I'm not sure, that light is awfully bright today on there. But I just simply take my finger, pull it back, run the iron along that edge, and with the starch, get that out of the way. I have a nice smooth edge on that. Boy, I really have a glare today. A real smooth edge along there, and I always find that it works really well with the starch for me. And so I will do that on both sides, and that's where I came up with, you know, the 2 blocks into the corners. And now when you're going to sew those together after you applique them, the one place that you really, and these two don't necessarily go together that way, because you want to make sure that you have your fabrics opposite of each other in the center. But when you're sewing them together, you really want to make sure that you mark that well so that they meet in the 1/4 inch seam, because if they don't, it's going to be very obvious in terms of that. And I'd like to also show you a little bit how I tackle, you know, the applique, so that we get, so I have taken a knot, put it at the back. I go in from the inside. If I turn this back, I'm going in from the inside so that my knot is within that the edge of my applique. And then to get that invisible, you know, stitch along there, and you could certainly use the acorn glue and, you know, glue the inside edges of this, but I go under and come out a little bit at an angle when I applique this down. So I go in where the thread came out, and I come up on the underneath side into about 1/8 of an inch, So under where I've come out, and I come up, and I know this is everybody has their little bit of a method of how they do this, but for me this works really well, and you don't see the stitches there, and very tight and secure, and so everything is pretty much invisible underneath because I'm going underneath again, underneath. I'll do it one more time, and then I come up on the back, on the underside. As I come up, it's on the underside of that piece, the top piece, and then you don't see the stitch at all on the top of that. And I probably should have used a red thread to show you that so that you could see that there is no thread really on the top of that. So appliquing that down, sewing it together like a 4-patch, and that's how I did my signature block. But I wanted to address, this template issue because the picture does show that it has points that meet in that point. And I will tell you that that was a little bit difficult when I sewed these two pieces together and tried to match them up in the center. And if you're going to go ahead and sew them by hand or machine, you will need to identify where that center point is and the center point there, and a little clip of this with the scissors will help that turn a little bit better. And it's possible to do. It was just a little bit more fiddly, and this did not quite fit the 6.5. The other issue that I want to share with you about that when you're working on a block, when this is a 6.5 unfinished and 6-inch blocks finished, and you put 4 of those together to get your 12-inch finished size. So I always give myself a little bit extra, so I cut my squares 7 inches, sewed them, together to get my half square, and then I trimmed it down so that I had a true 6.5 before I put my block on there. So let me see if there's any questions that you have in terms of the signature block. All right. Oh, Jennifer, I would love a nice warm morning in New Zealand. Yeah, it's summer over there. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to have you on here. And Kristen has done a wonderful job of putting up where you can just click a link if you do not have the acorn glue. The other thing that now I want to also talk about is marking your fabric, and let's do that with the turkey tracks. This block looks complicated, and I know that when I have taught it before, people see it as a very complicated block and they more or less avoid it. But it's actually quite easy to put together, and that's what I'm hoping to show you today, how that comes together so nicely. I am going to do it by machine today. It's quite simple when you do it by hand as well. I want to talk a little bit about sew line pencil, and as well a mechanical pencil, because these lines that we're making, and on this block, even though I'm going to sew it by machine, there's going to be, you're coming together to a point. So I have marked on the back side of all of my pieces, and I tried to make them, I think I used my friction pen on some of this. So I have my markings on my corner, on my corners of my fabric, simply because that's going to help me get the point where I need it to be before I sew it. And I want to show you that process. But I also want to talk a little bit about when you mark your fabric. A mechanical pencil um, is probably, and I love the Sew Line lead because it's a little bit chalky and it'll wipe off very easily if you can see through your fabric, like especially on this background fabric, you can see those marks through that. And the reason is because it stays sharp. You don't get, like with a regular pencil, it starts to dull and the lines get bigger. And this is, when we're sewing, this I haven't put there. When you are marking your fabric, this line is outside of that 1/4 inch ruler. And if we can, take a second and look at, grab this. I have put this on here and I have my 1/4 inch. I have the line laying right at the edge of the fabric. Let me move my thumb out of the way. And so when you mark, you are marking outside of that 1/4 inch line. So what you need to remember to do is that when you are sewing along here, you're actually sewing to the inside. I call it, well, it's really the outside because this to me is the inside. So you're not sewing directly on that line. You are sewing because that thread takes up space and you're going to get more than a 1/4 inch seam if you don't run your needle. And let me pull this through. And I hope that you can see that. I don't know. I was trying to get the camera to work this morning so that you can see the pencil line is still alongside of the thread, so that now when I measure from that thread to the edge, now I have a 1/4 inch seam. And not if I went directly on the pencil line with the edge of my ruler, I've got a thread's width on the end extra. Well, over time and over seams, that begins to add up, and you're going to end up, instead of with a 6.5 inch block, you're going to end up with a 6 1/4, or 6 and a little bit more than a 1/4, depending on if you're using double thread or single thread. So always remember that line is beyond the 1/4 inch, and you need to sew on that side of the line. And I just looked up and saw Kathy has a question. Could you make an hourglass block for the background to get the different colors in the corners? You certainly could. And I thought about that. And because of time, I just went with a half square triangle. But absolutely go for the hourglass block, and then you're going to have those different fabrics, and that would be absolutely beautiful. And thank you for mentioning that, Kathy. So anyway, let's go back and start the process of sewing this block, and why I marked those corners so that this top point is going to come out, pretty much the way you want it to come out. So this is my block that I finished, and you want that 1/4 inch seam line to be, up there, and you want those points to meet, so that this piece too, as we're sewing the curve around here, is going to fit in. So this is 1/4 of the turkey tracks that we'll put together today. So what I will do, so that I get this correct, I'm going to turn this over, put my pin directly inside that, or right into that where those lines crisscross. And now when I pin it, get that to sew. And I will have I'm just double checking that I have this, because I think I pulled the pin out and corrected. I do. So, and here is where, you know, if you're going to mess up, I would think this is, you need to have that 1/4 inch little triangle. It's not really a total triangle. It actually looks like the centerpiece, micro small is really thin. And Kathy had said 60 or 80 weight thread is very helpful to achieve accuracy, and you're right. I always use the Quilter Select Masterpiece, which, you know, in the 80 weight, when I'm sewing, it's very strong. It's a combination of polyester, cotton, and it's very strong in that. So now I've got that little teepee looking thing on the bottom. I've got, you know, this is pretty accurate all the way from the top, and I'm going to start sewing from this end. So because my machine, when I get down here, you know, we want it, we have a tendency to let our fingers go and it will get off, and if that point is off, you're not going to get that nice point at the end of that piece. So let me change the camera, and I am going to go under, starting at the point, and I'm going to put that point under just where the fabric barely touches the fabric itself, so that there's, you know, the first needle that, you know, when the needle goes down the first time, it is going straight into the fabric, and that it doesn't have an opportunity to move. And even so, I am coming down, and that sews right. I'm just cutting the so now when we open this up, it meets across that bottom part. All right, and it, actually on the camera the way, because it hasn't been pressed yet, and we're going to press this to the outside. If you look at your picture over here of the pressing, the blue completely shows through there. So I'm going to take, and again, when you are ironing, let me move this book out of the way. When you are ironing, you hit the side of your seam and then just let your iron sit there for a second or two. And you want to press between each one, simply because if you don't, that's not going to give you that sharp point up there on the edge. So now I have this side that I need to put on, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to take my pin, put it in, and find that cross in the back. And this really gives me the accuracy that I'm looking for. Let me drop another pin right there, get that one out of the way. Get this back in the screen. All right. again, just hitting that where the fabric is laying right there at the edge. And I'm not totally sure on camera, because I'm looking down here and not at the camera. You'll see that the needle will hit right on that inside of that pencil line to keep it at 1/4 of an inch. And that's because that pencil line takes up space. And sometimes we think about that stuff and other times we don't, and then wonder why our block didn't fit the way it was supposed to. And so now I need to, and when that comes back, we're gonna get rid of those bunny ears when we trim up our block at the end. But for right now, they're just gonna look funny out there. So I am setting my seam. I'm just hitting the seam line so it's nice and crisp. And with the white material, it's a little bit tough to see. But from the point of this to where that point where I'm going to be trimming it is over here, is just about 1/4 of an inch. I'm hoping it's exactly 1/4 of an inch when I trim it, and that's what you should have on that point. The rest of it looks kind of crazy because it's such a long, narrow point on there. So that section of the block is done. Okay, now we're going to sew. Let me find my pieces. We're going to sew this to that. I'm going to get rid of the book at this point because hopefully you have your book there, and the book is just really getting in my way. I'm going to find the center of both sides. So lining those seam lines up, I'm just going to give it a thumb. All right. Match those creases up right here. And I'm going to drop a pin in. Now here is where I think for many of you the glue would come in handy, and how you would use the glue at this point, because we're going to sew the curve, and when we get to that curve I will show you where the glue is going to come in handy. But again, I am going to start, obviously I don't have a choice on this one. I'm going to start by, going to this point. But this fabric, the background fabric, is rather thin, and it's wanting to move on me. So I normally wouldn't necessarily drop a pin in there, but I'm going to get started because the fabric does want to shift a little bit because of its thinness in terms of that. So this is just a straight seam across this part of it anyway. And making sure it stays lined up. And I'm going to drop that pin now down here at this end because I'm sewing into a point, and that is going to want to move on me, and I really don't want it to, because that will put me off when I go to sew my curve, and so I really want to keep that. And this is where I am going to use some type of stiletto or something, because I don't want to run over the pin, but I want to really hold on to that section. So I'm going to use my stiletto to move that fabric through all the way to the end so I don't lose my 1/4 inch seam. And it's at those points where it kind of makes it or breaks it in terms of accuracy. All right. So now I have, you know, that seam in, I want to again set my seam, just press against the edges, hold that down. And now I'm going to find the center of this block, so I'm going to match up those seams. And I'm going to go mark it right now where I'm going to be using it in a moment. Now I want to go to these 3 pieces, and I have this piece, I have, this is where and of course I did have it laid out straight. So these go in to make that curve, and this will make a straight line along here and a straight line along here. And again, you need to mark your centers. So first thing I'm going to do is find my center points, and I'm just creasing it with my thumbnail in the center there. There. And now I'm taking this piece and finding the center on both sides. All right, so I have my, my creased points, and now I'm going to sew that curve in here. So I'm going to pin where those 2 points come together. And here is where, the glue comes in. I'll put glue on one side, pin on the other, so you can see what I'm really kind of doing with the glue. I don't want it in my seam line, so I'm going to put a tiny drop of glue right there in the corner, and a couple of places along there. You don't need much glue in terms of that. And so now I can simply take and put that in the corner, and because I'm trying to do this on camera, I'm probably going to get that slightly off, and my glue is probably going to go on my fingers instead of staying where they are. And then once I get that in there correctly, see, I need to drop another piece of glue here. And I say piece of glue, glue isn't pieces. And I'm going to get that directly into that corner so it's aligned. Put it right there, and I'm going to dry that so it stays where it needs to stay. And go back. Hopefully my glue is still there enough that it'll dry in place, and I don't have to pin it. All right, so that side is glued. This side I'm going to just use pins to show you both ways that I do that, and I would do this if I was doing it by hand as well. No different in terms of the hand piecing. Generally speaking, you probably don't need to put a third pin in there, but I tend to put a 3 pins wherever I'm sewing on a curve. And if the curve is really big, I'll even go to 5 if there's a lot of space between, here, and there. Okay, so let me get the camera to the machine. And when you sew this, and so these sides are basically glued together, and as you sew and keep that edge, I reach under and take a hold of that bottom piece if you are watching as I'm keeping that 1/4 inch seam there, it's almost as though I'm sewing a straight seam. Do a little bit of adjustment on this side, keeping that top and bottom together, keeping it right on the 1/4 inch seam. Just take it slow. Again, I'm going to, let me move over to here. Set my seam in. I just touch the edge of it so that that seam line is nice and flat. Press it down, and I've got that first side sewn in. And let me double check. I think that's pressed the way it's wanting to go. All right, so now I have my markings on this side and this side again. I'm gonna just make that because I kind of ironed it out, and I don't see as well as I used to. Press that in. And if you're hand stitching this, you're sewing it exactly the same way that I'm doing now, except that you're doing it by hand instead of by machine. So I'm going to get that corner in there perfectly. Get that pinned so that that stays put. I'll drop another pin here in the center so that just falls nicely into place there. And go to this side, get this corner in right where it needs to be. And then I'll put another pin here in the center. All right, then we'll go back. So again, you can either glue this and put your drops of glue as you move along. Press them with the iron so that they'll, they go right in, and that's bottom. Because on occasion the bottom will, it has that wrinkle in it, so you just need to move it into place underneath if it wrinkles on you a little bit on the bottom side, and then just go slow. All right, set my seam, and again I'm gonna just take my iron, go around. I'm lifting slightly as I move it. I'm not running my iron down this. I'm doing it So now I have my other half with that. And now it's time to put this in to that. I want to find my center. I already have there. My center is, I can, I'm going to shoot for right in between into that about 1/8 of an inch piece. So that's my center point right in the middle of that. Again, pin that. I want my edge, and here is where it would be helpful to remove the bunny ear before you put this, so that you can see that you're getting it directly into the corner and getting that pin so it stays in place as you're getting ready to sew it. Here again, I'm going to drop a pin in the center, get that all moved in there. And here is where, I'm probably going to use a few more pins, simply because on camera it's going to make it a little bit easier for me not to wrestle it quite as much as I would. And I don't really mean wrestle. I just work my way around it with my fingers and stuff. And this way the pins are going to do the work for me. And, for right now, I'm thinking that's a good plan. All right. So I've used a few more pins, and if you're not a pin person, if you go, if you're a member of the Quilt Show, there's a section under Learn where Ricky Timms shows you how he does curves with no pins at all. So if you want to learn his method, it's basically just going slow and doing what I'm doing now as you sew, instead of using pins. So and I don't know where my other pin cushion is with the rest of the pins, so I'm just going to start sewing, and I'll work my way around that as I get to that. So I'll show you with lots of pins, and then how I, kind of tackle it. But the cool thing about this is that you're sewing, it just kind of lays right where it's supposed to as you're moving around. And I know with this fabric, pulling up, it's a little bit harder to see as I'm sewing, but hopefully you can see that, it as you work with it, it just kind of moves into place on those curves. All right, here I'm getting to the middle where I, don't have my pins anymore. So I am going to work it with my fingers so that, and I'm not pulling on this. You do not want to pull. I'm working pretty gently and taking a few stitches, moving along, and my camera in my face makes it a little bit harder for me to see. All right. But I'm keeping those edges together. That underneath, no wrinkles in it. We'll see how this comes out. Should be okay. Alrighty. So before the pressing happens there is your block. All right. With your seams and curves, don't have to necessarily scare you. I want to go back and make sure that I this points of the middle piece show up because the outside pieces have a sharp point at the join. Yes, you're right on that, Noella. And the 88. Okay, Sarah, thank you. Sorry, I want to make sure that I answer your questions. Full aside on bottom so the feed dogs grasp the fabric better. Absolutely. I don't think I said that, Kathy, so I appreciate that you guys are picking up my slack there. When I forget, when I'm concentrating, I can't walk and chew gum at the same time, and sometimes when I'm concentrating I don't always remember everything I was going to say, so I do appreciate that you add those little tidbits in. So there is the Turkey Tracks block, and because we have the next 2 weeks that we will not be on live, Facebook Live, that'll give you some time to catch up and have these 2 blocks for next week. I hope that you have and enjoyed that, and you've gotten something out of both of those. With working the template on the signature block and possibly doing it a little bit different, either make hourglass blocks to put in the back that come out to be 6.5, or that you have or use a half square triangle, whichever way you prefer to put those together and make them work for you. So I want to say, for those of you who celebrate it, Merry Christmas. The rest of you, happy holidays and the time off, Happy New Year. And whatever you do to prepare for that and being with family and stuff, enjoy every moment of it. And I will see you, I believe it's January 7th or 8th. I think it's the 7th. So I'll see you then, and we'll keep moving on through the book. And we're getting close to finishing all of these blocks up. And some of the tips that I gave you, I know that 1 or 2 of you are still questioning that Amish star. And again, working with that true 1/4 inch seam when you're putting your hand stitching in, making sure that it's on the 1/4 inch, and making sure your templates that you've copied off are the size that they need to be will help on that Amish star. So enjoy the next couple of weeks and the time spent with family and friends, and we'll see you in January.